All right, well, apologies for the delay. We had some technical difficulties, so thank you for bearing with us. Okay, so I wanted to give a talk today about using the CRS in the real world. So my talk is a CRS integrator's perspective and changing real-world customer needs. Why has that moved over there? Sorry, bear with me just a second. It doesn't help that I'm not used to using a Mac. There we go, that's fine. I can see what I'm doing now. Okay, so my name is Andrew Howe. I am a technical author and architect, and I work for a company called Load Balancer. I live in Southampton, which is the orange dot there on the south of the UK. And at Load Balancer, what we do is we produce a Linux-based load balancer. Called our enterprise product. It's a load balancer based on free and open source software. We do traditional layer 4 load balancing using LVS in the Linux kernel, layer 7 load balancing using HA proxy as a reverse proxy layer. Global server load balancing, we do Polaris and Power DNS, and we have a WAF component. And being fully based on free and open source software, for our WAF functionality, we use mod security with the core rule set. And we have some other bits and pieces of functionality in our product as well. So, in the beginning, we first introduced the WAF component of our product in our version 8 milestone release way back in 2015. And our WAF stack is based on Apache. We know Apache very well. It's very much a known quantity. We know its quirks. We know how it works. It's very reliable. So we use Apache in our WAF stack, and we use mod security version 2. Again, it's a known quantity. It's been around for years and years. It's very reliable, and it works very well for us. So when we first introduced the WAF functionality to our appliance, we based it on CRS 2.2.9. Unfortunately, we predated CRS version 3, which came in 2016, a year later, which is a bit of a nuisance, which ended up meaning that we were stuck on version CRS 2.2.9 for quite a number of years. So that's where we started with our WAF integration. So a little bit later on, in 2017, I first joined loadbalancer.org as a Linux engineer. And in 2018, we had one of our partners, one of our big customers came to us, and they had a very specific security problem that they were trying to address. And they asked us, can your load balancers, with your WAF functionality, can you help us plug this hole in our web application? And we said, yes, sure, that's fine. So we set about writing a custom mod security rule set for this specific partner, for this specific application. And I knew nothing about WAFs. We had one, as I think is possibly the case in a lot of organizations, we had one guy, the WAF guy, and he knew all the things. He knew how to write sec rules, and he was very much into his security stuff, and he was the WAF guy. He knew everything. And then he left. So that left us with a bit of a knowledge hole in the company. So my manager at the time, he was starting to do a lot of the NetNeo tutorials and read a lot of the reference material. And he brought me on board as well. He's like, hey, how would you like to get involved with learning Apache and mod security? And I was like, nah, that doesn't sound very interesting. It's too complicated because it's seen as this very complex thing. But and eventually I became involved in the project, and I read all the things that I think a lot of us do, read the reference manual for mod security, read the handbook, did all of the NetNeo tutorials, and started getting up to speed. So that's sort of where I came into the picture, and how I started getting involved in mod security and CRS. And at the time, sort of 2018, getting on to 2019, CRS version 2 was starting to feel quite a bit dated. It was starting to feel a bit old. CRS 3 had been out for a couple of years, and we were starting to realize that CRS 2, maybe we needed to look at replacing it. So eventually, I started work on a CRS 3 integration plan, where our load balancer appliance is put in the hands of all sorts of different clients and customers. When you're looking at migrating or introducing a completely new piece of software like CRS2 to CRS3, it's a big deal. It's a big project. There are lots of things to consider. You've got to think about documentation. You've got to think about training externally, training internally so that your engineers know how it works. So it's a big deal. So it took us a few years to go from start to finish. So we started thinking about it around this kind of time. And it was actually while I was working on the CRS3 integration that I actually, in 2021, I discovered a CVE in the core rule set itself. So part of the process of integrating CRS3 into our load balancer appliance was basically doing an audit of the CRS, going through every configuration file, reading every line of code, thinking, okay, if I introduce this into the hands of my customers on my customer systems, what impact is this going to have? And there was one file. There was, for those of you who know core CRS very well, in CRS version 3, we have our rule exclusion packages. And there was one rule exclusion file that was missing a line. It looked very odd. It was missing a line that all of the other files had. I was like, this is very strange. I'm sure there's a good reason for it, because the CRS devs are amazingly intelligent people, and I'm sure there's a very good reason for this. So I wrote into the security list for core rule set. It's like, hey, I think I'm probably making a mistake here, but maybe this is an issue. And it turned out it was an issue. And I discovered a request body bypass in one of the rule exclusion files, which was CVE 2021-35368. And that's how I became involved in the CRS project properly. On the back of that, I started doing commits and pull requests, and eventually I became a CRS developer as well. So, in terms of focuses and what we spend our time on, the CRS project itself, CRS is often focused on things like maximizing the threat coverage of the project, writing really complex WYSI rules with regular expressions that will melt anyone's brain, and allowing for really high security deployments. So these are some of the things that CRS is often focused on. But from an integrator's perspective, from a company who's using CRS and putting that in the hands of our customers don't care about any of this stuff. It's very cool and it's important work, but our customers aren't interested in this sort of thing. So in day-to-day real-world use, the sort of requests that we get are really mundane. The sort of things that customers are trying to do are actually quite run-of-the-mill. They're quite ordinary. They're actually quite boring compared to the cool stuff that CRS is doing. So I think it's important to have a really good balance between the cool, the fun, the cutting-edge stuff, and the day-to-day of it just needs to work, especially when we're putting CRS in the hands of our customers. So I want to talk about the big change that I can see on the horizon, and that's what I've called here the mandated WAF. So increasingly, we're seeing that WAFs are being mandated. So we're seeing this from regulatory bodies, we're seeing this from industry standards bodies, we're seeing this from state-run organizations. More and more, it's becoming increasingly normal that if you're doing any sort of installation, especially involving a load balancer, especially in front of web applications, a WAF will be expected. It's just expected that it's going to be part of the package that you provide. So more and more often, we're seeing deployments where they say you must have a WAF, and unfortunately, the people who are installing these systems, sometimes they don't have experience with a WAF. They might not know what a WAF is in an extreme circumstance. So we're seeing more and more often mandated WAFs, where WAFs are required, where there isn't necessarily the expertise or the skills to properly install and configure a WAF. So this is one of the big changes that I think we're going to have to grapple with over the next few years. So specifically, I think the PCI DSS is going to be a big contributor to this. So for those of you who don't know, PCI DSS is the payment card industry data security standard. So it's a security standard that companies are expected to follow if they process payment card information, so credit card details, that sort of thing. And the current version of the PCI DSS standard, version 321, it retires on the 31st of March 2024, so next year. And the current version of that standard, it talks about WAFs in one of its provisions. And it currently says that you have two choices to meet this particular requirement of the standard. For a public-facing web application, you have the choice of either reviewing the code of your web application annually or installing a WAF in front of it. So, of course, if you've got the choice to buy a piece of equipment, train your staff on how to use it, or just saying that you're going to review the code annually. Of course, a lot of people choose, we'll just review the code annually. Fine, no problem. However, version 4 of the standard, which was published in March 2022, changes that. And when that comes into force, from 31st of March 2025, so 2 years from now, the requirement that talks about WAFs removes the option to review the code. So if a company wants to comply with PCI DSS, they will have to install a WAF in front of their web application. It's a requirement. They no longer will have the option to simply say they're going to review their web app code. And that's a big change. I think as an industry, maybe we need to think more about how we're going to deal with that, because I think that's a really big deal, and we need to talk about it more. And another example, I put the NHS here, so the National Health Service in the UK, one of the biggest employers in the world. They have massive IT systems. It's becoming very common now that anytime there's a tender or an RFQ regarding NHS installations, they're saying you must provide a WAF as part of this solution. It's just becoming very common. So the result of all this is that we're seeing WAFs being put into the hands of people who have little or no experience in how to actually use, install, and configure a WAF. And sometimes this will be coming down from management. So you'll get a manager who says, you need to install a WAF, and the person they'll be asking to do that will have no experience in how to do that. They're just told from the management, you must do this, get on with it. That's becoming quite common. Alternatively, we can see teams with the wrong skill sets who are being expected to install web application firewalls. For example, networking teams. You might have a team of people who are very good at routing, switching, VLANs, but they have no real experience in web application security. They've never used a WAF. But often a WAF is just seen as just another network appliance, which of course we know it isn't. But when that's the case, often WAFs are put in the hands of networking teams who don't really have the expertise to properly use them. So as an integrator, as a CRS integrator, we need to assume that the person who will be responsible for the installation probably isn't going to be a WAF expert. They may not have ever touched the WAF before. And they may not even be competent in how to use a WAF. We need to assume that that's the level of understanding that our customers have. They might have some networking background, but in terms of web application security, we need to assume they probably don't have that sort of background. So how do we respond to this? So there's definitely a balance that needs to be struck between usability and usefulness. So on one end of the extreme, you have web application firewalls, which they're very usable, they're very easy to use, they're very easy to configure, but they're useless in practice. So maybe this is the sort of WAF that's a black box where you tick a box, tick WAF enabled, and that's the extent of the configuration that you can do. You can't see what's going on underneath. It may be a proprietary solution, and you just have to trust that the vendor is looking out for your best interests and it's actually doing what it says it's going to do. It's actually providing some protection. You can't tell, you can't see the logs, you can't look at the source code, but you've ticked the box, the WAF is on, and for a compliance perspective, you're good to go because you've ticked the WAF box. But yeah, it's very usable, but in practice it's useless. You can't really change it. So that's sort of one end of the extreme. And at the other end, at the other extreme, you have highly secure but Byzantine solutions. So something that's very, very complex to set up. Maybe you're expected to compile it from source, think mod security, and you're just left to your own devices. And I think there's sort of a compromise between the two, where you're just having anything in place and actually enabled, actually switched on, which doesn't break your entire web application stack. And I think that that idea of just having anything in place is probably somewhere over here. It's usable, it's doing something, but maybe it's not as useful and finely tuned as you'd hoped. And when using something like mod security, unfortunately, it often feels like we're more over this end of the extreme. So I feel like there's probably a sweet spot somewhere in the middle that would have a WAF engine with good integration, a rule set with good integration, and then a simple way of configuring that, which is easy to understand but also useful. I feel like finding that sweet spot and getting a really good integration of engine and rule set is really important. So Just looking at some examples of CRS integrations. Checkboxes. That's an easy one. Rule on, rule off. So just a list of rules, rule 920, 1100, etc. Tick it, rule enabled, untick it, rule disabled. Simple. Anyone knows if you have a false positive, just untick the rule is disabled, false positive is gone. Great. But that's not very flexible. That's a very hatchet job to enabling and disabling different parts of the core rule set. So although that's very simple to explain to a user, just turn off the rules that are giving you false positives. It's nice and easy. Anyone who has experience with the core rule set would know that if you're just doing a blanket global disable of a rule, that's a big problem for security, because you're turning that rule off for every part of your web application, potentially for every part of the traffic that's going through your WAF. So on-off checkboxes are very simple, but it's also very coarse, arguably too coarse for real-world use. And there are some integrations of the core rule set. I believe Snapped, who was a cloud-based load balancer, they did it that way. Again, very simple, but it's very coarse. It's not really great for security. On the other end of the extreme, how about free text input boxes? Actually, that's what we do at loadbalancer.org. We have free text input box where you can write sec rules, you can do custom stuff. So it's great for customizability. You can do anything you want that you can express in seclang. But it's also, you have to learn seclang to be able to do that. So it gives you the flexibility of doing all sorts of custom rules, but at the expense that you have the bar is quite high to be able to actually implement those sec rules, because it's quite a steep learning curve to be able to write Apache sec rules and start doing this stuff yourself. How about expressing seclang or a subset of the seclang language as JSON? And I think Azure do something along these lines in their WAF. That's a cool idea. You can sort of rationalize the language and express it as JSON, and then that's great for APIs. You can post it to your endpoints and it turns on your WAF with the rules you've expressed as JSON, and you can make it idempotent and all those cool whizzy things. But that's cool, but you're still having to learn a subset of seclang to be able to express those rules. So it gives you some flexibility, but you still it's still quite a steep learning curve. So there are lots of ways that this is approached in the real world. I've seen vendors who have CRS integration do all of these things. So there's a very wide gamut of stuff that's done in practice, and some of it works better than others. And I do feel like, as a CRS project, if there was some formal guidance that we could produce, and we could say a good CRS integration should do this, this, and this, I think that would be a really good starting point for especially new integrations, to say, how are we going to implement CRS? What's the best way that we can do this? And how can we sort of reach that sweet spot between usability and usefulness? So maybe something that says, like, a good CRS integration means you can set the content types that you would allow. You can set the methods, the HTTP methods you'll allow, and it tells you all the things you need to do. And if you meet all of these things, then you get a tick, and that's a good CRS integration. I feel like for an integrator, especially someone who's just starting to add CRS to their offering, that would be a really good checklist of things that they know that they need to do in order to have a really useful, usable integration. Because as it stands, a lot of integrators just sort of make it up as we go along and sort of think, what would be useful? I guess this would kind of work. Let's see how that goes. And you end up with quite a wide range of different sorts of implementation, some that work better than others. So I think guidelines would be a really good thing for us to look at in the future as a project. Log4Shell and friends. So I'm sure a lot of us, when Log4Shell came about, a lot of us were running around trying to secure custom systems. We had dozens and dozens and dozens of customers emailing in every day saying, how about Log4Shell? Can you protect us? Can your WAF protect us against this? So these are the sorts of things that our customers really do want, and they really do actively ask for. So I think, as Felipe touched on in his talk earlier, we have the plugin mechanism in CRS 4.0, and something we've talked about as a project. We haven't formalized anything yet, I don't believe, but something we've talked about inside CRS is the idea of having some sort of security plugins. So when the next big Log4Shell vulnerability comes about, we can start publishing these rules ahead of time as a plugin. So the problem with addressing a big vulnerability like Log4Shell as a project is we can write the rules for it, but we can't immediately publish that as part of a new rule to the rule set, because if you do that and your customers download that, then potentially they're going to run into false positives. So it's really difficult to push new rules out to your customers without breaking things. So I think the flexibility that we're going to have with the plugin system is really powerful. And I'm really excited at the idea that the next Log4Shell, I can publish a Log4Shell plugin to my customers, or whatever the vulnerability may be. I can give my customers a plugin and say, if you want to turn on protection for this new vulnerability, check a checkbox and it will turn on the plugin. I think that's going to be really, really cool. And of course, integrators have to deal with legacy systems. So I'm very, very much mindful of the fact that I'm going to have to support CRS-free installations for probably the next 5, 6, 7 years, however long that my customers are using it. So with the plugin system as well, it should be for someone who's competent with CRS and ModSec, it should be relatively simple for us to take those plugins for CRS4 and translate those back into some sort of CRS-free friendly mechanism, so that we can also take those security plugins and backport them for our CRS-free customers. So I'm really excited about the flexibility that we're going to get with plugins. Logging options. I don't know a great deal about logging. That's not really my background. I've played a little bit with OpenSearch from AWS. I'm aware that there are lots of other options. You can do cool things with Kibana and others. Proprietary ones as well, not just free and open source ones. Grafana and Prometheus, all those sorts of fun logging, stats, dashboarding things. I think this is something that our customers ask for, but it's something that I don't think there's a lot of literature about in the free and open source side of things. A lot of integrators, ModSec and CRS integrators, have their own internal documentation on how to plug into these other systems, and some integrators even have their own proprietary plugins and things where you can talk to these third-party logging systems. I just think as an open source community, this requires really good, consistent documentation, and probably also some examples and some guidelines on how to do this. There are a few bits here and there on the internet, but I think as a CRS project, it would be really cool to see something formal published. I know it's something we've talked about in the past, but I think it just requires having some operational experience with these systems and producing some really definitive documentation on, okay, you want to make CRS talk to Splunk or whatever. This is how you do it. These are some guidelines on how you should be attempting to do that. I think that would be really cool as well. Because, this is something that our customers are often asking for. Paranoia level 0. Now, this is an idea that's been thrown around a little bit over the past few years. So something that you could call the set it and forget it mode. A colleague recently talked about the idea of having an always on by default WAF. So of course you couldn't realistically just turn on a WAF, turn on CRS and just hope for the best and it's going to be fine. You're always going to run into one or two false positives. Even at paranoia level 1, you're going to probably run into a couple of false positives, especially if you have a web app, which is doing some weird and wonderful things, using some unexpected HTTP methods, or it's doing some weird stuff with how it encodes characters. We do run into this in practice. So even on PL1, paranoia level 1, you're always going to run into one or two false positives at a minimum. So the idea of having a paranoia level 0 can be quite appealing. This idea that you can give it to customers. You can tell a customer who isn't very WAF savvy. They're not necessarily have a background in how to use a WAF. You can tell them, okay, you can turn on this minimum mode, which gives you some protection, and you don't have to worry that it's going to break your web applications. So something that's even simpler than paranoia level 1. That's quite an attractive idea, and especially having the idea that having it always on by default, we're so confident that it won't give you any false positives. Anytime you set up a reverse proxy on this load balancer, you're going to have CRS in paranoia level 0. That's a cool idea. But on the other hand, would it actually be useful? I don't know. It's an open question. You think most web servers are doing the basics anyway. For example, if you try and submit a malformed HTTP request line, if you've got something like Apache that's sitting and doing reverse proxying, Apache is probably going to give you a 400 error anyway. So often the software that you're using is already covering the very basics in terms of rejecting stuff that's obviously malformed. So how much value would a paranoia level 0 bring to the table? I don't know. But as an integrator, I'm really interested to have this conversation and to think about what we could potentially do. Maybe just a really basic subset of CRS that just has the things that are blatantly, obviously wrong. But again, how much of that is already covered by stuff like Apache and reverse proxies? Possibly quite a lot of it. So I think it would bring some value to the table. I think it's worth discussing. That's something that I'm quite interested in. That's a discussion I'm interested in having. Training. Now, this is something that I was doing customer training just on Friday, just gone. There's a lot of ground to cover when you're training someone in how to do mod security and CRS. And this is sort of a two-pronged issue, I feel. So on the one hand, you've got customer training. And training a customer can be very difficult and it can be very expensive. Unless you're a mega corporation, but even then it can be quite difficult to do. So when you're trying to teach someone mod security and how to use CRS, there's such a lot of ground to cover. And you may find that you're having to start from the very basics, especially if you're training staff who then they don't have a security background. They may even have never seen a mod security logline in their life. And that can be the level at which you're starting from. So you have to take them from that level and take them to a point where they can be competent to tune away false positives, for example. So there's a huge amount of ground that you need to cover. And a person who can confidently deliver that sort of training to a customer, it's quite likely that their time is going to be quite expensive. So you have the problem that to train a customer can be very, very expensive and can get expensive very quickly. So that's one problem to deal with. And training your staff internally as well. When you're an integrator, when you're having to teach both your developers, your engineers, and your support staff who are supporting your customers, it can be really, really difficult to teach staff internally on how to use CRS and mod security. I really do think that to teach an engineer to use ModSec and CRS, they have to be motivated to learn it, and they have to be interested in what they're learning. Otherwise, it's completely pointless. And to find the right sort of person who has the spark, the motivation to learn this stuff and to apply that knowledge, that can be really difficult. And then you've got a problem with retention and churn. So often you'll find that in any sort of company or integrator above a certain size, you're going to have a problem with your support staff, with churn with your support staff. And you've got to keep that training fresh. So you've got to constantly keep retraining these engineers in how to use CRS and mod security. And yeah, it just becomes a real burden. And there's plenty of documentation on how to use ModSec and CRS. We've got some great documentation that we're in the middle of rewriting in terms of on the CRS side. Mod security, you've got the reference documentation, you've got the handbook. There's so much documentation out there, but it's often very lengthy and very complex. So that doesn't help. Could we do more in terms of writing more basic how-to guides, maybe tutorial videos? Maybe that would help. But that's a big investment on its own to keep that up to date and to produce that sort of content. That can be really difficult and expensive as well. So I really don't think there's an easy answer in terms of training. I think this is one of the most difficult problems as an integrator, one of the most difficult problems we face. So sort of in conclusion, talking about training, whether you're training a customer or you're training your internal engineers, if you're training the wrong people or people who just aren't ever going to use that knowledge, they're never going to apply their learning, or they're not interested, it can often feel a bit like this. You have this WAF, which is this impenetrable black box, full of wonder, full of magic and mystery. Nobody really knows how it works. And to try and train people to really understand how all the bits fit together, that can be a real challenge. So I think training is one of the biggest issues as an integrator, especially working with customers with a non-security background. It can be really, really challenging. So in conclusion, I've raised a number of points, a number of issues that integrators are likely to face with when they're integrating CRS. So mandated WAFs, we're seeing a lot more WAFs being required. It's just expected that WAFs are part of reverse proxy integrations now, and putting those WAFs in the hands of engineers and operators who aren't WAF trained. Good integration. finding that sweet spot between something that's usable and something that's useful. And I do strongly feel that having formal guidelines from CRS in terms of what should an integration look like, that would be invaluable. And I do think that would help us to see better quality CRS integrations moving forward in the future, especially as CRS now is being integrated into any kind of service mesh or reverse proxy open source solution. Yeah, everyone wants to integrate CRS in some fashion. So I think having guidelines would increase the quality of the integrations that we see in the future from projects, especially that perhaps don't have the background and training to be able to do it themselves in a very effective way. Security plugins and vulnerability response, that's going to be awesome. I can't wait for CRS4 and plugins. That's going to be so cool. Training, I don't think there are any easy answers to the training question. I do think that the integration and the usability discussion will help. Having a more usable integration certainly will lower the bar for training, but I think it's an open-ended question. I'm not sure what the easy answers are. I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts on that. And everything else, logging options and paranoia level 0, having some documentation on how to integrate CRS with different logging tools is going to be invaluable, and I really think we need to write that. And the conversation about, do we need a paranoia level 0, something to catch the very basic attacks that means you won't have any false positives, but you will have some level of protection? I think that's a really cool discussion to have, and I think that would be an interesting path to explore in the future. That's everything. I haven't really given a very technical presentation. I've probably just more unloaded the burdens and open questions that as an integrator we often have. But hopefully that's perhaps given those of you who are more technically minded a bit of a glimpse into sort of the things that we deal with when we put the CRS into the hands of people who aren't very technically trained, into a wide audience. These are the sorts of questions, these are the challenges that we face on a day-to-day basis. So, yeah, thank you for listening to me ramble. And are there any questions? Okay.
Yeah, I have one. So basically, it was an excellent presentation. I think that I share most of the things you're sharing here that we need to think about and document better. One of the things that you raised, it's really interesting. Is like how do you think we are going to backport plugins? Because the plugins concept is very, very useful, as you said, but backporting is something that has so many changes to. I think that we don't really want to look that much back, but in the end, I think that I agree with you that we need to, and that's a real challenge. How do you think it's going to be?
That's a really good question. I think integrators, I'm very conscious of the fact as an integrator, I'm going to be responsible for looking after CRS3 installs for maybe in the next decade. Who knows? So I think integrators internally, they need to have the skills on staff to be able to take CRS4 sec rules and be able to put that into some sort of mechanism that meshes with whatever their CRS3 integration looks like. The ability to take CRS4 plugins and mesh them back into CRS3. I think maybe we could do a blog post. Maybe we could provide, again, some sort of guidelines or examples of maybe you could do it like this. I think it really depends as well on when you're looking at integrated CRS solutions, it depends a lot on how they've implemented CRS. If they followed sort of the standard way of deploying CRS in terms of the files, the structures and whatnot, and where things are placed, then I think it would be quite easy because it's just sec rules at the end of the day. I think it would be fairly simple to implement plugins in a CRS3 friendly way. But I'm aware that some vendors have a more exotic way that they've implemented CRS that might be more difficult, and they might need to think about how they do that themselves. But yeah, I think a blog post would be a really good place to start. Just give some ideas on this is how you could do it. I think somewhere in the docs, we currently have like one or two sentences that says, if you're running CRS3, it's really easy to backport plugins. Just copy them into a folder and do this, that, and the other. So I think we have some really basic guidelines, but I think expanding that would be really, really useful, especially for stuff like, as we start doing like vulnerability plugins, there's going to be, yeah, when we're publishing stuff that's CRS4 specific, for the next log4j, CRS3 people are going to need that. So we're going to have to give some guidelines on how to backport that stuff. That's a good question. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, here. So one problem probably everyone has faced it is what do you think is a nice pattern to handle multiple CRS configurations for multiple instances?
In terms of having different versions?
And not only different versions, like the false positive fixes and custom rules.
That's a difficult question. I'm not sure I've seen a really good solution to that. Certainly, how we do it at Load Balancer, as I say, we have like a free text field where you can put in your false positive fixes, and you mix in that with rule exclusions, and you mix in your custom rules, and it's all sort of mixed together. I don't think that's necessarily the best solution. And as I mentioned earlier, that's also quite complex because you have to know how to write sec rules, and that can be quite difficult in itself. I don't know. I think that's something that perhaps the CRS team needs to go away and think about, and then suggest, like, if you're integrating CRS, you should have a file over here, which is your rule exclusions, and a file over here, which is your custom rules, and think of a logical way to split that up. And I think as well for other engines like Karaza, having a clear way that this is how we see it being implemented, and you put these files here and these files here, I think that might be useful for other engines to think about how they start structuring things as well. I think the idea of just leaving it as an open-ended question for the user can do it however they want, and they can put the files wherever they like. I think that's a bit of a cop-out. I think we need to give more solid structure. I know that we have rule file 900 and 999, which is where you're supposed to put your rule exclusions. I don't very often see anyone actually doing that. Maybe we need to enforce that and explain why you want to do it that way. I don't know. I think it's an open-ended question. I haven't seen a really good answer, but I would like to find one because I would like to use it.
Yeah, everyone. Thank you.
Any other questions? So the question was, how do we handle multi-tenancy, and how do we sort out the logs? Again, that's a really good question, and it's one that I would like to see some really good guidance on a good way to do multi-tenancy like that. How we do it at Load Balancer, we have quite a simple method, but it's also quite effective. So we have just a separate Apache Apache virtual host for each instance that you're going to have. So let's say you've got 5 different web applications. You through the web interface, you create 5 reverse proxies, and you turn on the WAF function, and that leaves you with 5 Apache virtual hosts pointing to 5 different, including the core rule set, but you end up with 5 virtual hosts with 5 different custom config files. So then you can do things like split out your rule exclusions per application. Logging as well in each virtual host points to a different directory. So it's dumping its logs separately. So web app 1, web app 2, web app 3. Again, as I say, it's a very simple way of splitting up for multi-tenancy, but it's quite effective. But again, if CRS turned around and said, we think you should do it this way, or this is a good solution for how to make CRS log separately, then we would probably implement those sorts of guidelines. But yeah, a simple Apache virtual host works very well.
Next one here. Thanks. I'm wondering how hard is to deal with custom rules from customers and updating the core rule set itself. I mean, I feel bad that if a customer starts to having several custom rules, then you basically are bundled to a specific core rule set version in order to, because of ID conflicts or whatever conflicts. Do you have internally to load balancer something that could help to upgrade the core rule set, but still rely also on custom rules that the customer may have wrote back in the days?
Good question. So at the moment, we don't have any specific mechanism or guidance for doing a CRS rule set update. But we are imminently going to be releasing, depending on what comes out of CRS, if we get a version 3.3.5 or if we get some advice on how to create a latest, greatest rule set. We are about to, probably in the next month or so, going to have to release a CRS rule set update. So I imagine the advice we will probably be giving when that update comes out is when we release a CRS patch version release, which maybe patches vulnerabilities, the theory being we would test that, and in theory, a patch release of CRS shouldn't break any existing implementations. So if you've tuned for version 3.3.3, then if you install 3.3.5, it should just continue to work. In terms of when you're going from like a milestone release, so like version 3 to version 4, when we eventually integrate version 4 once it's released, that's a good question. I know that when CRS version 2 to version 3, the official advice was throw out your rule exclusions, start again. It's so different. You're just going to want to start again. Although I know there was a mechanism, there was like a mapping between the CRS2 rule IDs and the CRS3 IDs. So in theory, you could map them and you could sort of reuse your rule exclusion. But in practice, I believe the official advice was forget it, just start from fresh. It's so different, start again. With CRS4, where it's going to be the IDs are the same, and as a lot of the rule set is unchanged. I think that's a good question. I think maybe education as a blog post, maybe pointing to the bits that are new and saying, hey, you can reuse your rule exclusions for all of these bits, but be aware that there's this new file, there's the email rules, there's SSRF. These are the new things you're going to have to monitor your apps for, because there's a chance that these things are going to start breaking things on your web app. So maybe giving that as an upgrade path, saying, hey, here's some guidance. Look out for these things. They're probably going to cause you new false positives. I think that's maybe a sensible way of doing it. I don't know.
Many thanks.
Any other questions?
Sorry.
Oh.
Just on the plugins, like, is there sort of a limit to what can be done with them? I'm just curious because this is all kind of new to me. So, like, would you be able to implement stuff like port spoof or honey ports through the plugins?
Implement something like what, sorry?
Port spoof or honey ports through the plugins.
So the plugins themselves are, and I'm sure someone will correct me if I misspeak here, but my understanding of the plugins is it's a series of CRS modsec rule. Well, it's a series of rule files that you can put setclang rules into, which sits next to the core rule set. So the idea being that it gives you different hooks, different points in like execution of the CRS into which you can start applying your own detection logic. You can also start incrementing some of the variables that we use in CRS, so you can play with some of the mechanisms that CRS provides you. So you're limited in terms of what the engine can provide. So it's still just doing basically it's doing modsec setclang sec rules. So anything that you can explain, anything you can describe in sec rules, you can add to a plugin. So you can, the idea being for any sort of exotic functionality that falls outside of what CRS should offer. So if you want to do something slightly bespoke in terms of some sort of DOS protection or something, and you want to start using like some of the slightly more unusual functions of the engine, like modsec does things like you can do persistent collections, so you can like store stuff to a database and start doing that's all been taken out of the core rule set, so you can use it in the plugins instead. So you're limited in terms, only limited by what your engine can do, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And they're conf files that live alongside the CRS. So as an integrator, we would be loving to providing like a set of plugins that our customers can use and say, hey, plugin 1 does X, plugin 2 does Y, and you like tick boxes to turn them on and off. But yeah, in theory, you'd be limited only by what your engine can offer. Good question. Thank you. Okay. Oh, no.
Just a question about the degree of freedom you give to your customers in terms of customization of the rules. Because
what, sorry?
The degree of freedom you give to your customers for the customization of the rules, because you may screw up the entire thing very easily. Mm-hmm. And do you do some sanity check before, or you do blue-green canary deployments, so to keep them safe of themselves.
Yeah, we give them total freedom, and the exact thing you described, I've seen happen, unfortunately, in practice. So you do. There's certainly, I think, there's a fine line to tread between giving someone total freedom to do whatever they want and putting some rails in place and like letting them restricting what they can do. I think it would be probably a good idea to do things like check that they never ever do sec rule remove by ID for the blocking rules, which I've seen happen in production, and it's just like, why would you do that? Our documentation says never touch this rule, this rule, and this rule. Why would you do that? But if you don't make it clear and you don't do some sort of like input validation, then you can see how that could happen. Like in the logs, I keep seeing this rule keeps appearing in my log. It must be a false positive. And if they don't have the training and the understanding to know that the inbound blocking rules aren't false positives, you should be never turning those rules off. If you don't have that education and you're not doing input validation, then you can end up with those sorts of mistakes where they accidentally disable the whole CRS. So yeah, I think that perhaps is something that we would have in our guidelines if we were to say a good CRS integration should not allow you to accidentally turn off the inbound blocking rules and just turn off the WAF. I think that would be maybe a good thing to have. That's a good idea.
Thank you.
Anybody else? If not, we'll wrap up. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.